Thank you, Patrick. I'd like to invite our panelists for the first panel up to the stage. I'm going to introduce briefly the moderator of this panel, and then she will go on to introduce the others. Hudock is the Senior Vice President for International Programs at Plan. And I have a special story about meeting Anne. Many years ago, I was getting started in my first job out of graduate school at the Wilson Center. And Anne was there, and she had just written a book about her experience in Sierra Leone. And my supervisor at the time said, I want you to go hurry up and read the book and interview Anne. And I had about 5 minutes to read the book. And I had a wonderful discussion with Anne, and she was so kind and gracious. And here we are many years later, and I'm very excited that Anne, with her leadership, has led her team to be one of our key partners in this summit. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. You know, I think Andrea and my mother are the two people who've read my book, so I really want to extend a very special thanks to her for that. It's an honor to be moderating this first panel today, and I believe this is going to set the stage for the next 2 days of conversations and deliberations, and as Patrick said, really fun. I think this is such an amazing time for all of us to be gathered here. I think recent events have certainly changed the conversation and really deepened people's awareness of the importance and the value of a dialogue like this. So I'm really honored to be here with all of you today. I think the topic of understanding strengths, needs, and priorities of all adolescents is certainly one of the more timely topics that we could be looking at. More than half of the world's population today, as Patrick mentioned, is under the age of 30. And the vast majority of those are living in what we thankfully used to call the developing world. And now, thanks to the SDGs, we can just say in countries. And millions of those are advancing, but millions more are not. They don't have education, they don't have employment, they don't have training, as all of you know. And typically, adolescent girls and the discrimination that they face has really held them back from advancing, and that's a powerful focus for us to be looking at here today. The only way to tackle the challenges that adolescent girls and youth face is to put them at the center of development, as has been mentioned, and to really own the priorities, the implementation, and the resources. These are very powerful advocates and change makers and innovators. Last year, Plan conducted a very large study of youth called Hear Our Voices, and that's on our website for anyone who hasn't seen it. In that survey, we spoke to more than 7,000 young women and men from 11 countries, and some of these were the most marginalized adolescents whose voices were seldom heard even in their own communities. So what did they tell us? 1/3 of the girls said that they never decide if they want to become pregnant. For 33% of the girls surveyed, that basic control over their bodies and their future belongs to someone else. Along those same lines, just 26% of girls were certain they would choose whom to marry. A girl in Cameroon said, "Some parents use their children to settle debts, thereby forcing them to get married to people they don't love." On the level of daily interaction, 1/3 of girls said they never speak up and say what they think around boys. And 25% of girls never feel comfortable using the school latrine due to the lack of privacy. So given this, it's critical that we start with youth and youth perspectives. Throughout this summit, you're going to be hearing directly from youth. Plan's broad survey of youth voices really told us what we already know. But what we were surprised by was the extent of these challenges. These are big issues, they aren't fringe issues. These are all common problems that youth face. Girls and youth want to transform their lives from a cycle of poverty to the cycle of opportunity. And we're going to hear today from this panel about interventions that have succeeded or not, and why. The main message that I want you to take away really is that youth are part of the solution. To be part of the solution, youth need to be heard. It's not about what we do for them, but what they can do for themselves. Our job here is to really open spaces for youth so they can find their voice. And our role is to catalyze their voices to action and to take leadership. As Gloria Steinem famously said, power can be taken but not given. The process of taking is empowerment in itself. And I think that's a very significant message for us today. So let me introduce this distinguished panel and turn to them for their remarks. First, we have Kristin Brady, who is the Director of Youth Development at FHI 360. Next, we have Ariel Cerrud, who is the Senior Manager of International Policy at Advocacy for Youth. Followed by Jean Manney, who's the U.S. Country Director for Restless Development. And Patrick mentioned Zambia in his opening remarks, so I want to follow with my own Zambia story. I was doing a discussion with civil society activists in Zambia, and there was one person in the room who just overwhelmed me with their insights and with the level of engagement and the practical solutions they had. And of course, it was a Restless Development representative. So with that, let me turn to Kristin.
Thank you very much, Anne. My job at bat here is to help set the context as we begin our 2 days talking about adolescent boys and girls. I'm going to talk about three things: why we need to focus on adolescents, what's happening developmentally to adolescents, and how do we best support them. So first, why are we here? We all know about the large youth population. Some people call it a youth bulge, but we're really talking about adolescents, not just about youth today. And at this point in time, we have the largest generations of adolescents compared to other populations than at any other point in time. That's 1.2 adolescents between the ages of 10 and 19. Even though we have the largest population of adolescents, it seems we're just catching up to that reality. I was struck the other day when I was at the launch of the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Well-Being, when they referred to a comment by the Lancet editor-in-chief several years ago, who called adolescents the most pervasively neglected population in global health. And we know that adolescents in general are generally pretty healthy. But I just want to comment on one statistic to highlight how we need to better understand and support adolescents. Although HIV-related mortality has dropped for all populations except adolescents, the mortality rate for adolescents has tripled. And we know that girls are much more vulnerable to HIV, as young women ages 15 to 24 are 8 times more likely than men to be HIV positive. When we look at adolescents, it's hard to understand why it's such a neglected population. I like this picture of crossroads because I think it reflects the critical and pivotal nature of this time in life, and how one passes through this crossroads can have a lifelong consequences among many aspects of our lives. So during this period of life, adolescents make decisions relating to education, to work, and many of them begin to work. Many teens, particularly girls, become married, have children, and young people develop the values and morals that impact the kinds of citizens they'll become. And in terms of gender norms and the impact of gender stereotypes intensifies during adolescence, and young people developed their gender identity and sexual orientation during adolescence. So let's talk briefly about what's happening developmentally during adolescence. Psychologists talk about 5 facets of development, so let's just briefly review them. The most obvious and easiest to understand is the physical development, where we see rapid growth and sexual maturation. It's also a period for greater potential for addiction and a time when we form habits that impact our health. According to WHO, 70% of premature deaths are attributable to unhealthy habits established during adolescence. Cognitively, it's a period of dramatic change as teens develop the ability for abstract thinking and they expand executive function skills, such as making rational decisions, setting goals, organizing, and planning. Adolescents are intensely social, particularly during early adolescence, and one's peers have a bigger impact on who you become than during any other point in life. This is developmentally necessary as young people are building the kinds of social skills they'll need during adulthood. As parents of teens know, I have 2 adolescent girls, adolescents go through huge changes with great periods of emotional and sensitivity and mood swings, and gradually, over time, become more aware of and more able to control their emotions. Finally, youth are building their values and ethics, and are often highly idealistic and have greater concerns for their community and fairness, which explains why so many young people are involved in political movements. All right. This doesn't, oh, there we go. Okay, so I know we're all going to talk about some of the wonderful things about youth, and I think it's really important we remember the positive things about adolescence. Adolescence is a period of great opportunity and growth. Adolescents can be tremendously creative and enthusiastic and bring that emotional intensity and idealism to the issues they care about, making them great change agents and innovators. Adolescence is a period of incredible changes in the brain. It's only the second most important period of development in terms of the brain. The adolescent brain goes through a period of pruning and myelination, which makes the brain more interconnected and efficient, and goes through a period of use it or lose it development, which means that the kinds of neurons that we use during this time period, the kinds of things that we do, will either strengthen or they'll wither away and die. So what happens, the kinds of things young people are involved in during adolescence, has a long-term impact in our capacities. And it's a period when the ability to develop social and emotional skills is malleable. It's an important period of time. If we haven't developed those social and emotional skills, it's an important time to do so. So this graphic is another way to think about adolescent development, and I like it because it shows in such a poignant way some of the things, the challenges that are happening during adolescence. This graphic was developed by George Patton from the University of Melbourne. And if you look at the graphic, if you look at the pink and the orange lines, you see a huge increase in depression and self-harm. And we know that girls are twice as likely as boys to suffer from depression. And that suicide is the 3rd highest cause of mortality for adolescents, and that half of mental disorders begin during adolescence, by the age of 14. The purple line shows that increase in emotional intensity I just talked about, which flattens out over time. The green line shows the increase in substance abuse, which is related to the blue line, which shows impulse control. We've learned in recent decades that the part of the brain that enables us to use reasoning and judgment and to weigh consequences is not fully developed until the mid-20s, which means that young people often react out of the emotional part of their brain as opposed to the reasoning part of their brain. And as a result, there could be a greater likelihood for violence and crime and other risky behaviors such as reckless driving, which is why one of the leading causes for adolescent mortality are road accidents, as well as violence. This is one more graphic, another way to think about adolescent development. And this graphic was just developed by a consortium led by the University of Chicago as part of a study to look at the foundations for young adult success. And it looks at the critical stages, skills, developmental phases, and influences over the life cycle. In early childhood, in the middle of the circle, we need to focus on building self-regulation skills. In middle childhood, the exposure to knowledge and skills. And if you look at the top of that circle at mindsets, these are the kinds of mindsets we develop, the things, the attitudes and beliefs we have about ourselves and about the outside world and how we interact with the outside world. And it's particularly important what kind of mindsets we form during this early adolescence. It can be a period where some people talk about a growth mindset, where we really is an opportunity to build new mindsets about gender and who we are and what we can become. Or it could be a time when gender norms and stereotypes set in and they become more fixed, making it harder to change your perspective about your abilities and your opportunities. And mindsets are influenced by peers, by the way by the way adults treat adolescents, and by broader norms. When we look at the late adolescents, we're focused on building our values. And then if we look at the orange circle, it's about building our identity, further developing our concepts, and building agency so that those skills that we have built, we have the ability to take an active and intentional role in making choices and shaping the course of our lives rather than being at the mercy of different changes. So it's a nice way to think about different life stages. So now I want to talk briefly about what we should do to support adolescents. As I mentioned earlier, social and emotional skills are particularly important to develop during adolescence. These kinds of skills can rival IQ in predicting educational attainment, success in work, health, and whether a person might be involved in crime. To help inform work with youth under USAID's Workforce Connections project, we work with Child Trends, who carried out research to identify the most important soft skills for youth success in the workforce. And these 5 skills, as you'll see in this diagram, are those skills that are most important for success in the workforce. And while the research didn't show that there were different skills girls and boys need, we do know that boys and girls manifest some of these skills differently. So we know, at least the research in the US, is that during early adolescence, girls have lower self-esteem than boys. And we also know that boys and girls develop social skills in different ways. So if we think about girls demonstrate much more caring and intimacy through their social relationships, whereas boys' relationships are more characterized by friendly competition, by excitement, by risky activities. So even though the skills are similar, the way that we develop those skills and what they mean for us are quite different for boys and girls. So we're building on this research now that we know what skills are important for workforce outcomes under the USAID Youth Power Action Project. We're now researching what are the same kinds of skills that are important for reproductive health behaviors and the prevention of violence. And we're also looking at what are the kinds of skills, how do we develop those skills? How do young boys and girls develop those skills in different ways? So next I want to talk more broadly about how do we support young people? And that is talking about the positive youth development approach. This approach grew out of the failure of earlier youth development approaches that focused only on prevention, most focused on single issues such as teen pregnancy, the prevention of involvement in crime, and out of research that begun to understand the impact that peers, families, and community members and norms and perceptions can have on youth outcomes. The PYD approach came about as youth practitioners changed their focus from asking how to prevent negative behaviors to why youth thrive. Positive youth development grew in the United States and other developing countries, and increasingly is used throughout the world. Researchers have identified a number of features most commonly associated with positive youth development, and with strong outcomes for youth that we've included in this graphic. If you look at the blue squares, these are what some researchers call the big 3 of positive youth development. And those are opportunities for skill building. So we know that young people need vocational skills and academic skills, but they also need the opportunity to find their passions, to find what they're good about, what they really get excited about. So those can happen through sports, through theater, through recreation, through tutoring, for volunteering. It's really just about helping young people find something they feel passionate about and they're good about. It's about positive relationships, and particularly positive relationships with adults, and having good adult role model. And then it's about youth engagement, but I know Ariel and Jean will talk about that. Other aspects of positive youth development relate to how do we perceive young people, having positive perceptions and high expectations for young people. At the same time, setting positive social norms, making clear boundaries of what's appropriate behavior, making that clear to young people, creating a sense of belonging and a sense of safe space. And we found that when people use positive youth development approaches, they have, let me get back on that one. There's impact across multiple sectors. So reduced crime and violence, delay of sexual activity, increased academic success, increased community engagement, reduced substance abuse, and improved relationships. So positive youth development can have impact across multiple outcomes. And I really look forward to hearing from others of experiences of different strategies of how we support youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ariel?
Thank you. Is this on? Perfect. Well, let me begin by thanking the organizers for today's and tomorrow's summit. I know that folks are coming off an exciting day yesterday at the U.S. State of Women's Summit, and I hope that energy and that passion moves forward over the next 2 days. I can't begin my remarks by recognizing the fact that many of us in the room are here today, including myself, present with a tremendous amount of grief and loss and fear over the events that happened over the weekend in Orlando. And I want to be intentional in recognizing that. As a gay Latino immigrant, bilingual Panamanian who grew up in Oregon, I know what it's like to find safe space in a place like Pulse when you don't have a safe space at home, at school, in your church place of worship. So I know that for some folks they may find challenging trying to understand why it means so much for us, but I know that for many folks, a place like Pulse was home and was a place where folks could feel safe and loved and could express their love without fear, and to have that shattered and taken away is a horrible act. And as the days and weeks move on and we start to make a sense of this tragic loss, I think it's important, and my ask for all of you here in this room is to not be complicit in the erasure of those who were lost and the lives who were lost, recognizing that those who were in the room were Latino, LGBT folks. They were queer people of color. They were immigrants. They were trans folks. They were undocumented folks in the room. And as we see, the narrative play out in media, I'm hating seeing the erasure of their lives and their identities. And I ask each of you, as you move on, to recognize that they were Puerto Ricanos, that they were Dominicans who were in the room. And I think it is appropriate that we are gathered here today, as we talk about gender roles and patriarchy and homophobia and Islamophobia and transphobia, anti-Blackness. How does that play out in our conversations around gender? And yeah, I felt the need to start there. But with that, I want to thank the organizers again for being here today. As I said, my name is Ariel, and I work at Advocates for Youth and lead our international policy work. And one of the great joys of my work is really working directly with adolescents and driving policy and making policy changes at the local level, at the state level, federally here in DC, and also internationally. For those of you who aren't familiar with Advocates, we're an organization that's based here in DC that partners with youth-led young leaders and adult allies to advocate for policies and champion programs that recognize young people's inherent rights to honest sexual health information. We believe that young people should have services that are accessible, that are confidential, that are affordable, and really the resources and opportunities necessary to create sexual health equity. At the core of the work that we do is believing in centering young people's lived experience in this work, right? Recognizing that they are the best advocates for themselves, that when we invest in young people, we continue to build a pipeline of leadership that continues to bring a new generation and really brings honest truth to the work that we do. One of the questions that was asked of us to talk about in this opening panel was the question around how do we really hear adolescent girls and boys, and how do we support them as being agents of change and development projects? So at Advocates, we do this by building an organizational culture that sees young people as partners. And you'll hear me say this word, partners and partnerships, over the course of my remarks today. Our underpinning philosophy, what we call the 3 R's, rights, respect, and responsibility, is underpinned in all of our work, both programmatic and policy and in the advocacy work that we do. We believe that young people have rights, and that they should have rights to protect their bodies and their sexuality. We believe that young people should be guaranteed information and access. We believe that they deserve respect, that oftentimes young people are pushed aside or are seen as the end delivery of a program or an initiative, right? They're not seen as partners. And we believe that as a society, we have a responsibility to ensure that young people are equipped with the tools and informations and resources to lead healthy lives. We believe in creating programs and initiatives where young people have consistent opportunities to feel physically and emotionally safe, to build relationships with caring and connected adults. We believe that young people should acquire knowledge and information, and that we should engage them in meaningful and purposeful activities in a way that offers both continuity and variety, which speaks to your, kind of some of the principles of positive youth development. Again, at the core, our relationship to young people is that of partnership, and in my role, in my capacity as someone who leads our policy work, it's my responsibility to partner with young people to drive advocacy efforts. One of the big campaigns that we just wrapped up, I think, is a great example of that, which was our Moment campaign that focused on centering adolescent girls' experience and lives in the post-2015 development process. And without going into a whole other conversation around the new Millennium Goals and the agenda, I will want to say that the campaign was again committed at centering the design of the goals that centered young girls, right? And in our campaigns, we sought to ensure that the needs and rights of girls were guaranteed in the global agenda. Particularly, we worked with adolescent girls, and we took some of the principles that were developed in the Girl Declaration, which is some of the work that the Nike Foundation did around ensuring the rights for education and health, safety, economic security, and citizenship. Those 5 goals are enshrined in the work, in the overall missions of the Sustainable Goal. So in partnership, as I say, we developed what we call the Girl Engagement Advisory Board, which is a team of 10 adolescent girls who range in ages from 15 to 19, and they called home, Cameroon, Bulgaria, the United States, Kenya, Pakistan, Madagascar, Jamaica, and Nigeria. We engaged in advocacy efforts to engage adolescent girls, and they helped us guide our work. And this is an important piece there, right? Oftentimes when we develop programs and initiatives, we engage young people at the end of that process, right? Oftentimes in just the delivery of the message of the campaign. But we were very adamant in our work, and again, part of our beliefs with the 3 R's is that we engage young people throughout the whole process. So again, we asked the question, how do we really hear from adolescent girls and boys and support them in being agents of change? We do so by building campaigns in partnership with them and centering their stories and their personal narratives in the work that we do, in this particular instance, in the international development work. We center the lives of adolescent girls, particularly those from the developing countries, and we were successful in partnering with adolescent girls to highlight their already existing work, right? And that's another important piece in the work that I do, is oftentimes uplifting the work that already is happening on the ground, that oftentimes goes unnoticed. We uplift the stories of girls like Crystal, one of our partners in our Girl Engagement Advisory Board. She was 19 from Jamaica, who was working with her community to break down barriers of stigma associated with speaking out about sexuality. We uplifted the stories and lives and equipped and trained a young woman by the name of Hamna. She was 17 from Pakistan, who we brought to New York to speak face-to-face with the UN mission in Pakistan, because she felt that there was a real lack of inclusion of adolescent voices in the conversations that were happening in New York, but more importantly, that they were being left out and they had something to say. So we trained them, we brought them in. Adolescents need partners in the development work. Adolescent boys and girls need adults who are willing to secede power and control. And they need organizations and programs that have a culture that enable them to come in and equal, not as the end delivery of a project or initiative, but really equal partners. And that takes adults willing to secede that power and that control. We need to center their experiences and allow for them to center their experiences, and we need to build ongoing pipeline of leadership and learning that allows young people to move along in the advocacy efforts. So that's what I wanted to say, and those were my remarks for this morning. And I hope that as we continue the conversations, both here in this room and in the breakout sessions, that we center young people's experience. And I'm so glad to see so many of them in the audience today. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ariel. Jean, let me turn to you.
Thank you. Oops. there's one more before that. There we go. Thank you, and I just want to say it's an honor to be on the panel with such great organizations that we've partnered with before and look forward to more. So Restless Development believes in the agency of all young people to lead change and development. And for over 30 years, young men and women have been leading Restless Development's programs, reaching out to adolescent girls and boys and empowering them with their own agency and capacity. And it's holistic programs that we do with sexual and reproductive health and rights at its core. So with young women leading and tackling that, we've been addressing and challenging gender norms and gender issues in our roots. And we strive for a gender balance, both in the young people leading our programs and who they're reaching out to. But we've realized over the last few years that we need to do more to make sure that we're analyzing and building and designing programs programs and environments for girls and women's development that are really ensuring that the outcomes are as much for them and that they're able to participate and looking at the environment for that. So we've been taking on a new effort launching this year that we're going to be analyzing this within Restless Development across our programs, learning from what our country programs are doing. And also learn and share from other partners. So I'm really glad to be here at the Gender Summit this week and look forward to bringing learning back to Restless Development as well. But the focus on girls and gender issues more within Restless Development is coming both needs-based and demand-driven. One example is Restless Development works in India and Nepal on both sides of a shared border. And we've been doing program there for decades and decided to listen to young people. We wanted to check in and wanted to see if we needed to do different cross-border programming. So we did some youth action research. We had adolescent girls and boys on both sides of the border in consultation workshops on understanding what the issues they face and what they most wanted to see tackled. And what came out of that on both sides of the border and both girls and boys was gender issues and gender discrimination issues. So that kind of came out loud and clear to inform programming going forward. And we also heard this globally. Last year, Restless Development launched what we called the Big Conversation, and it came out of the post-2015 process and Ban Ki-moon calling on young people to be torchbearers of the next Sustainable Development Agenda. And so we said, that's great. Let's do a consultation on what needs to really change in the world for this to happen, for young people to lead development, and also to ask what the most important issues that young people wanted to see addressed. And one of the underlying things that came out from young people, and this was 5,000 responses over about 60 countries with in-depth stakeholder consultations in 8 countries where Restless Development is. And that inequality came out as underpinning all change that young people wanted to see, and young people wanted to see an end of all forms of discrimination. So we're really seeing young people calling for this to more tackle this issue and make sure, as much as we're achieving for young people, we know that young people aren't just one group, and we need to make sure we're addressing that for all young people. We're also seeing it as needs-based, in addition to demand-driven from young people. So, for example, in Tanzania, we've had, again, programs for years engaging girls and boys, young men and women. And we were looking at our M&E data and our evaluation outcomes and seeing that the outcomes for girls were not as strong. And that's coupled along with additional challenges, as Kristin was speaking to, that in Tanzania, the HIV rate for adolescent girls is going up as it's going down for boys and the general population. So we decided to have a program focused on women. And girls, and so the target was adolescent girls, organized into girl groups and clubs, and young women as volunteers. And so that's Restless Development's model overall. It's young people, usually a young man and a woman, as a volunteer, and then organizing young people into groups and clubs. We decided to do all girl groups and young women, one national volunteer from a part of Tanzania, and then one young woman from the community where we'd be working. And at first we decided to have some young men as male champions in the programs too, but we found that even in that the boys were still kind of dominating the discussion and the girls weren't speaking up and participating as much. So we decided to really kind of focus the programs on girls still. And when I visited last fall, I had the chance to go to Tanzania to visit Restless Development's work there. And the program had been running for a couple of years, and we saw empowered girls, and we saw visible support from community members and community leaders. But we also had the question of, this program's great, can we have the program for boys too? Boys need these benefits. So we know it's important to involve boys in the program, also make sure we're having benefits and impact for boys as well, and so plan to kind of have parallel, separate programming where we bring them together as well. So we're learning in this way, and that's been the model for Restless Development in a lot of ways. For example, in India, we'll have programs where the girls and boys will separate to get peer education and support around puberty and what's happening for themselves and for other, and it's really important to have that space to learn and feel safe, but also to learn about the other, so you dispel myths and the kind of fear of the unknown. And just one other example I wanted to share was in South Africa, where we did a piece of youth-led research on sexual and gender-based violence, and we found that young men and boys were also facing abuse and sexual and gender-based violence. That it's a complex issue that if they're not standing up to masculinity norms, they're facing that as well as boys. And it wasn't being talked about. We work in the Eastern Cape, and it was really not coming out. It was more obvious for women and girls. We found that the pressures that they're facing around masculinity and conforming to that, or not feeling that they're living up to masculinity based on economic situations, that they were also facing abuse, or it was driving their perpetuation of abuse. So it's a complex issue, and I think it also shows the importance of listening to young people and having other young people listen to other young people and gather those stories for us. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about our Girls Empowerment Program in Tanzania, and talk about how Restless Development believes we get to transformational change through that. So this program is called Mabinti Tushuke Hatamu, or Girls Let's Be Leaders, and as I said, it's in Tanzania. And I want to give a special mention to my colleague Loveness Sanga, who's in the red shirt. She was a Restless Development volunteer and is now leading our Girls Empowerment Program, and wish she could be here today on the panel instead of me, but I've taken some of her perspectives to share, but wanted to mention her. Right, there's three elements that Restless Development believes are essential for transformational change: deliver, influence, and inform. So deliver is pretty straightforward. This is where we know we need outcomes and impact for individuals and communities. And in the case of the Mabinti program, this is about building the agency of adolescent girls in groups and individually, and improving their lives. And this is done in three ways: sexual and reproductive health and rights education, so a message and empowerment around my body, my right. Economic empowerment, so supporting girls in groups to have a business, and then supporting girls to go off on their own business as well. Because we know that without this, girls are doing whatever they have to survive. So we can empower a girl to believe in her body, her right, and want to make decisions that she wants in her life, but without any kind of economic income or independence. Girls are forced to do things to survive. So that's an important element too, as well as amplifying girls' voices through community events. And we have a Young Journalist project where girls are trained to be reporters and gather stories and interviews and do radio shows. And it's also about creating and improving connections to services, whether it's SRH services, supporting to return to school, working with police and health clinic staff to be more youth and girl friendly, and creating safe spaces for youth. So the second part is on influence, that we know to go beyond individuals reached and for lasting change, we need to influence policy and society. So we do this through creating a supportive environment where we're improving understanding and support from communities and local systems and structures, through community events to show the capability of girls, and through stakeholder feedback meetings with police, with families, to get feedback and build trust. And this is where we're really engaging men and boys in this as well, that, you know, and reaching out to fathers and boys in particular. Is we see that gender-based violence starts with and is perpetuated by boys seeing it from their fathers, and early marriage also being pushed by parents. So how do we help them see the impact of this on women and girls and make a different decision? And how do we empower fathers to become advocates for their daughters' rights? So at first, when we had these parent seminars, it was mostly just mothers showing up, which is probably not surprising, but we did more to really reach out to fathers and get them there, and have girls tell stories about what their lives were like before being part of the program, what their lives are like now, the impact the program has had on them and participating in this, and what they want for their future. And parents have really seen the girls have been transformed, and they're feeling more responsible for what's happening in their community. So the second part of influence then is about policy level change, and this is sometimes, you know, policies need to be changed. There's a child marriage policy in Tanzania that it's legal for girls to marry at 14 with parental consent. So obviously that's a barrier to then tackling it at an individual level. Often there's also policies that exist, but they're not implemented or enforced or really accepted yet in communities. And this is the case with the reentry policy, which grants girls the right to return to school after they've had a baby, but this isn't being implemented at the local level, and we need to work towards acceptance. Okay, the last piece, sorry, I know we're running out of time, is inform. And so this is where, you know, if we're doing the community deliver and policy level change, then we need to share what works and build the evidence base. And just one closing recommendation is about engaging girls and boys from the start, that we need to really build this space to listen to girls and boys and young people. And we need to think about how we're going to make that space and time, but also how we're going to incorporate that feedback, and if we're prepared to change based on that, if we really say we want to listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a great opportunity now for each of you to ask questions. Perhaps not each of you, but we do have microphones around the room. So I would ask that you introduce yourself and your organization, and we'll take one question at a time. We have about 20 minutes before we need to break, and so and by the way, I know a lot of you, so if there aren't questions, I will start calling on people who I know have really interesting things to say. Who has the microphone? Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Jill Gay, What Works Association. My question is how you're documenting what you're doing and how you're showing that it works.
Is it for anyone in particular or just for the panel? All of the above. Great. Who wants to start?
I can start. I mean, part of how we're doing that is we also involve young people in our monitoring and evaluation, and so young people are involved in, you know, as I said, from design, but also, you know, feedback loops, so we can adjust if programs aren't working, and then part of the final evaluation as well. And I think that's really important, to be getting young people's perspectives along the way to see if it's working from them and to get insight on that.
I'll quickly answer for the work that we do. You know, advocacy, the ME in advocacy is always a fun piece to discuss. You know, I think I will say that for us is seeing an ongoing relationship building between power players and the young people that we work, right? Whether that's at a level like the UN or at local at the community, and ensuring that there's strong communication, ongoing communication. And then I think for us also in the piece around uplifting voices is like how often can we get our narratives in local media, in a community center. That's how we measure some of our success in our work that we do.
And I think, one of the challenges we have in the field of youth development is that while there's a tremendous amount of research in the United States and other developed countries, there's not as much research in the developing country space. And so with the project that I lead, Youth Power Action, we're doing a number of different pilots where we're first starting with reviewing the evidence, and then we'll identify from that evidence what do we think is an appropriate model that should be piloted and tested, and then doing a very careful feasibility analysis about the impact of that study so we can enrich the evidence base that we work from. We're also looking to develop an instrument to measure soft or social emotional skills, given the importance of those skills for multiple outcomes for young people. And so right now we're conducting a review of what instruments are out there, so that we can start beginning to measure those skills and how they change over time. And then we'll look at how we can adapt and build on those existing instruments.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for this interesting panel. I'm Cynthia Steele with Empower, and I really appreciate the whole day being framed in a context of understanding the fluidity of gender and sexual identities over time. And my question speaks to that. That can oftentimes be even more challenging in international settings and more conservative societies. And so I'd be interested in your experiences in trying to introduce these topics and also elicit input from young people.
Who would like to start?
I can go. Yeah, I think for us, ensuring the safety of young people in our program is, paramount, and especially when we are talking about, issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And this is where working directly on the ground with partners and knowing what is the context and the landscape, I think is really important, right? We've been very lucky to partner, and like as I mentioned in my statements, we partner with youth-led or youth-serving organizations, both here in the U.S. but also internationally, and we really, get a tremendous amount of insight and know-how from them. When we work with the LGBT community in Pakistan, for example, we build some strong relationships with partners on the ground who can provide the safe space and have the one-on-one relationships and connections with the individuals on the ground to be able to facilitate the programmatic work that we want to implement or the advocacy work that we want to implement. And I think the other piece that I would like to mention on this topic as well is that, we've done the work internally as well to ensure that we create a safe space for young people. And one of the pieces that I constantly like to talk about in this work is, what is our commitment to young people in the organizations in the long term beyond the time that we may be working on a particular program and initiative. And I'll give an example of, when we saw these anti-homophobic or, anti-LGBT legislations come up in places like Uganda, for example. We've had programming in Uganda over the last decade on reproductive sexual health, and we've done some pieces on LGBT advocacy. And while that's not currently happening, when we saw these laws and this rhetoric pop up, we had our activists, our young people, reach out to us for support, right? And we've had to have a really intentional conversation about what is our responsibility as a U.S.-based organization who works in these countries. And while we may not have programming, during the time that they were with us, they were the face of the work, right? And we put them in that situation, and the partnership that we have allowed them to, unfortunately, be put in a place where they had their pictures in the newspaper and they were outed for the work that they do. I think I would like to say that they came to us and they continue that partnership, and we have strong relationship, and it works because they recognize that for us, it's not just a one program connection and it's not a one program interaction, but rather it's through the whole, life cycle of the young person and the people that we're working with. And we have the policies and we have the culture in place to recognize that. So that's what I would say for our work.
I think our experience is similar in some ways, that, we take an approach to being inclusive and creating safe safe spaces, having the peer-to-peer approach. It is challenging. Restless development is almost more like a federation where we have nationally registered organizations across Africa and Asia that then work with our offices in the UK and the US as well, and so also work in Uganda, and I think that's a challenging space where the law was saying your staff could be thrown in jail, and the majority of our staff are national, our staff. So it is that sense of how do you have global stances and policies and approaches, but then understand local context, protect your staff. So this is an area that we want to pay more attention to this year, and would love to learn more over the next 2 days and through partners, because it is something that we're grappling with.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. And I think I would just underscore some of the things that Jean and Ariel have talked about, which is the importance of creating safe space, the importance of listening to young people, the importance of letting people debate and explore what they think, because they're developing their own values and beliefs. And then remembering that we need to work not just with youth, but also with the adults, and help adults understand young people better. I've been surprised at how little understanding there is about adolescent development in particular. And so we need to work with youth as well as the adults that they interact with.
Great. Hi, I'm Nitya. I work in a nonprofit back in India. We run after-school programs for kids in underserved communities, and we also have a young adult program. We run in 5 centers across 1 city, and I'm wondering how you guys scale your work, because how do you hire, how do you control for quality, listening, debate, letting the youth listen, debate, and explore? These are very crucial things, and how do you control for quality?
So I think the question was really about how do you, if I understand correctly, how do you develop your staff and create that environment in some of the programs? Is that right? And scale, yeah, that is a really important issue. I work with a program in Mozambique where we work with orphan and vulnerable youth. And one of the most important factors for success in the program is the facilitators who work with those young people. And before we hire any facilitators, we take them through a several-week training program where we observe how they interact with young people. And so we only hire the ones who show the kind of respect and support for young people that we expect them to have in the program. And as we're thinking about scaling that, and you think about the human quality of those people who interact with youth, it's a real challenge to think about. One is how do we model that behavior? How do we demonstrate that in the way that we work with our staff as well? But it's a big question, because that human element is so important for the touch points with young people. So we need to think about how do we take that to scale.
Great.
It's a very good question, and I think within Restless Development, we have built structures as well as a culture. So we have global values that are owned from the top, from our CEO and COO as well, but also part of everything that we do, part of every orientation, induction, part of our performance review, part of the design of all of our programs and decision making. I think that really unites us, as well as kind of a common global structure of goals and approaches and a strategy, which then can get nationalized. And then, when it comes to our volunteers leading programs, they've got quality standards and structures and strong M&E system, but then there is that leeway to listen to young people, adapt within communities. And it's something that we're looking out as Restless Development is thinking about scale, and not through opening more Restless Development offices in other countries, but how do we work through partners, and how do we share our model? And that raises another then question about the kind of quality control. So really interesting for us in the coming years.
No, yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
I would just add, I think it's really important to also remember that not every program should be taken to scale,
right.
and that I think there's a real power in keeping things small and letting those approaches really have the quality that they need to achieve the results that they're aiming for. And then the scale can come in certainly at the global advocacy level or even national advocacy level. So really linking that evidence base of truly quality programming into a broader conversation and dialogue, I think, is critical. We have a question right up front, and I'm not sure if our people with the microphones saw it. There, oh, look, they're right on it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
আমি নাজমুন নাহার নূপুর বাংলাদেশ থেকে এসেছি। তো এখানে জেন্ডার সমতা সম্পর্কে অনেক আলোচনা হচ্ছে। তো আপনারা অর্থনৈতিক দিক নিয়ে বিভিন্ন কাজ করেন। তো আমার প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে আমরা আমাদের যে চিরাচরিত প্রথা আছে যেখানে মেয়েদেরকে উঁচু করে দেখা হয় না, দেখা যায় যে মেয়েরা তারা মনে করে যে মেয়েরা শুধু সেলাই করবে, গরু ছাগল পালন করবে, এটাই। কিন্তু মেয়েরা যে কম্পিউটার শিখতে পারবে, মেয়েরা যে তারা ইংলিশ স্পোকেন ক্লাস তারা করতে পারে, এভাবে তারা দেখে না। আসলে এটা কিভাবে এটা আওতায় আনতে পারেন? I'm Najmun Nahar.
No. There you go.
It's working? Okay. So I'm Najmun Nahar Nupur. I'm from Bangladesh. You have talked about economic empowerment of the girls, and this is a gender summit where you talk about gender equality. But most of the time in my community, I have seen that girls are only perceived that they will do a set of skills like sewing or, gardening. But for adolescent girls like me, we might want to learn computer, might want to learn spoken English, but no one ever designs anything for us. So how you tend to mitigate those measures? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think we've all seen one too many sewing programs around the world.
I think one thing is to expose those adolescent girls to role models, to people who have done different things, and I've seen it over and over again, the power of just a single person coming to talk to them and showing the kinds of a different pathway and the kinds of things that can be possible. The other thing I would say is start early, start young, exposing young girls to different career opportunities, to start them thinking early on. So that they make decisions, whether that they realize they're making decisions or not. Perhaps in early adolescence, they might drop out of school, or maybe they don't have a choice but to drop out of school. But those decisions impact the rest of their lives, and sometimes they don't start thinking about a career until they're 17 or 18, when in many ways lots of decisions were already made when they decided to drop out of school. So start early and lots of exposure to different role models.
I will say for our work, part of our instance on having the lived experiences of adolescent girls and their stories be placed in community like communications channels, so newspapers and radios, was for that very reason, right? We recognize that oftentimes the voices of young women who are doing amazing work, this is not participating in the sewing program, are not being shared and are not being talked about in larger media and larger narratives. So for us, it was really important to uplift the stories so that the adolescent girls did have the example in terms of role models that they can look to and see kind of where their paths could go. And that's how we do it, and also equipping them with the skills necessary to do that as well, right? Whether that's building a personal narrative or talking to press and media. We're very we're intentional in building those skills in our young people because we recognize the potential that they have in terms of uplifting their voices.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the question. And I think it's really speaks to listening to girls about what they want for their own lives, the ideas they have for their own business or their career. And we do that. We'll work with young people either individually or in groups to have a collective business and have them share ideas, but then also help them maybe do a market assessment to see what the demand is. And the just final point I'd say is the importance of mentors and role models, and just getting more awareness about options that are out there.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so I'll let our... There you go.
I come from Bangladesh. I work for the Asia Foundation, and thanks to Nupur, she raised a very important question in terms of our culture. One question is in terms of engaging the community leaders, I mean faith-based leaders and others. I mean, how far do you think it is significant? And in terms of measuring the outputs we are gaining or the changes we are making, perception is one thing, but again, behavioral change is another thing. So how do we distinguish these two, and where do we put more emphasis in? That's my question. Thank you.
Good question. Should we start with Jean?
Sure, I could maybe speak to the community leaders question, because it is really essential. And where Restless Development works, we work in communities where we're kind of invited in, and there's a process of reaching out to community leaders about what Restless Development is about. The young volunteers who are from that country or the community, kind of building it through that. And I think helping them to see the benefit to the community overall by working with young people or by working with girls. I think that's one way of, how do you see it being part of the whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo the same thing. I think it's incredibly important for our work to ensure that we have the buy-in from community leaders and who are oftentimes the gatekeepers in our communities, right? And we've seen the incredible work that can be accomplished when we do have their buy-in and we do have their support. And oftentimes at the community level, the advocacy and engagement work that we do is to try and get them on board, right? And ensure that they recognize the inherent challenges and opportunities that adolescents, adolescent boys and adolescent girls can bring to ensuring a better community or a stronger community. So that is part of our work that we do at the local level as well. So.
I think one important starting point is helping community leaders see their own communities from the eyes of young people. We developed an approach called community youth mapping several decades ago, where young people went out to their communities and mapped them to say, here's where there are spaces for youth. Here's what's friendly about a community or not. And then showing the results of that to community leaders helps them see their own communities from a different perspective. We've just implemented an activity in Mozambique called the Youth Scorecard, which was designed to help stakeholders first develop indicators to measure how well they were supporting young people, and then have different stakeholders carry out that same activity so we can see how well a community is doing in supporting young people. And we did that building on a tool that was developed here in the United States called Development Assets Profile. And so we adapted some of the characteristics of that looked at the external assets and supports young people need and the internal assets. And so we identified a number of indicators, and then within each community, different members got together and talked about and measured, scored on a Likert scale, how well that community supported young people or not. And so being able to see that from the perspective of young people and understanding the breadth and the different ways that communities touch young people, because I think a lot of times they just haven't stopped to reflect how well we support young people and see it from the perspective of young people.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I want to appreciate all of your questions and the interest you've shown, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their remarks.